Thank you very much, Rudy. Our second speaker is Arlo Griffiths. He was a professor of Sanskrit at Leiden University between 2005 to 2008 and has served as professor of Southeast Asian history at École française d'Extrême-Orient, posted at its Jakarta branch office since 2008. His research is based on manuscripts and epigraphical sources from South and Southeast Asia, both in Sanskrit and in vernacular languages. Among his current projects are the edition of the corpus of the inscription of Champa from Vietnam, a study of Sanskrit inscription of Arakan in Burma, and editions of the Hindu ritual manual from Orissa in India, and of Sanskrit Codex Unicus of the Buddhist Tantric scripture in Nepal. As regards Indonesian materials, he has published thorough articles on inscriptions and related antiques from Sumatra and Java, and is involved in the École française project towards an inventory of all pre-Islamic inscription of maritime Southeast Asia. His paper today will be on language, epigraphy, and art, inscribed Buddhist bronzes from ancient Java. Please help me welcome Arlo Griffiths.
So after these remarks so broad-reaching and central to Southeast Asian art history by Professor Woodward, I offer you some very marginal remarks which also pertain to material that's largely just beyond the scope, the chronological scope of the Lost Kingdoms exhibition. In fact, I think it would be very difficult to assign any Indonesian bronzes with great certainty to the 8th century, and most of them quite more likely to the 9th onwards. But so I beg your forgiveness for being a bit beside the point, but nevertheless I hope there's something of some interest in what I have to say. And I would like to introduce the topic by going even farther to the east than the central Javanese and Sumatran material that I will be concentrating on, and also even farther from the chronological bounds set by the exhibition, namely to East Java in the 13th century, where presumably from around the site Candi Jago, we have so far found 4 copies of this plaque, which has an identical front, but an inscription on the back which gives the same text, but which is not actually always in the same layout, meaning that the inscription was engraved after the sculpture itself had been poured in a mold. And what does this inscription say? It says something in 11 or sometimes 10 or 12 lines of Sanskrit, which I will also not read out, but the text, when divided into 3 sections, reads like this. It starts with the famous Ye Dharma formula, which I imagine Professor Skilling will say more about later today, and which is also something of a red thread in my presentation. And then there's a statement of the donor saying that this is a donation of the excellent follower of the great vehicle, the Mahayana, that is the devotee of the supreme jewel, the illustrious overlord of kings, King Shri Kirtanagara Vikrama Jnana Vajratunga Deva. And then it closes with the dedication that whatever merit is in it, let that be for the attainment of the fruit of the highest knowledge of the totality of all creatures, to begin with masters, teachers, and parents. So a very typical Mahayana statement focusing on the complete liberation of all beings. So if we look at that, we find the name of the donor, and because this king is fairly well known from other sources, we can place these bronze plaques in time, and we learn something about the religious motivation of this, the production of this work of art. Now, an example from North Sumatra, the Padang Lawas region, which has just been the subject of an important archaeological publication by my colleague Daniel Perret, a volume on excavations that were carried out there between 2006 and 2010. And there will soon be a second volume where I have a contribution on inscriptions. And one of the items there is the inscription in Old Malay language on the back of the base of this bronze sculpture kept in the National Museum in Jakarta. And what does the inscription say? It says, "Prosperity, elapsed Shaka year 961, third day of the waxing fortnight of the month of Chaitra, a Friday. At that time, the master smith Surya manufactured Lord Nokanata. He expressed his intention by citing scripture, 'These roots of what is good do I share with all beings and turn over to their unsurpassed perfect enlightenment.'" So again, we have a very similar statement of motivation, but different from the preceding example. We have here a very precise date, which we can convert very precisely into, what was it? A specific date, which I don't know by heart, in 1039 AD. And it also mentions, apparently, the artisan who was involved, Master Smith Surya, and it mentions the precise name of the icon on which the inscription is engraved. So various little elements of interest for history and more specifically for art history. So what do inscriptions like this help us to understand about ancient Indonesian sculpture? Or, of course, more generally, what do inscriptions of this type help us to understand in general about Southeast Asian and South Asian art history? So firstly, very importantly for history, the date of manufacture. Explicit sometimes, as in the second example, or, as in the first example, inferable from text external information, namely the name of a king whose dates we know from other sources, or, and this is unfortunately the most common case, based on paleography, that is the comparative study of the shapes of letters, which we can put very roughly on a timeline. So if we see the shapes of letters even without any internal date, we can often pronounce or some kind of judgment on how old the piece bearing that inscription might be. Secondly, the iconographic identity of the sculpture. And this is an aspect of scholarship that is often a little bit neglected because many art historians do use textual sources only to some degree. And I think what is very interesting and a very rich contribution from the study of inscriptions is that we can actually say in many cases, well, this is what the people themselves called this piece. So inscriptions, like other textual sources, help us to get, let's say, an indigenous view on how people identified the sculptures that they worshipped, and rather than our Western categories, which are often only a rather indirect reflection of the ancient categories. Then also very interesting, we can get information about the persons who commissioned the works of art. King Kartanagara in the first place, and in the second example, very unusually, apparently the artisan himself, although this is a problem of interpretation. And then, as I said, as in the second case, artisans involved in making the piece of art, and also their general religious motivation, sacred texts that inspired their practice, because these people often quoted sacred texts from Buddhist scriptures, and more general, their cultural and linguistic background. As I said, the second example was in Old Malay, so this teaches us something as to the languages in use in North Sumatra in the 11th century. So now I would like to present to you several categories of inscriptions on bronze works of art. Now, I'm limiting myself here to sculptures, that is icons. If I were to take into account also ritual utensils such as bells or various pieces of pots and pans, so to speak, then the number of data would increase, but would still be fairly small for Java, certainly if we limit ourselves to the period before 1000 AD. Java becomes very rich from the 11th century onwards in various bronze artifacts inscribed, but funnily enough, production of sculptures, icons in bronze, virtually stops Actually, that example that I started with was one of the very, very few Buddhist bronze sculptures from the East Javanese period. For such bronzes, we really have to look into the Central Javanese period. That means before 925 AD. So here we see a sculpture in the possession of a collector in Amsterdam, which says in very clearly readable letters Sang Hyang Rahu, which means God Rahu. So we learn who this figure is if we didn't know from other reasons. This is, of course, not specifically a Buddhist figure. Neither is this this lady on this little gold plaque held in the Ethnographic Museum in Leiden, which has a very nice label inscription on the top, which says Pattaratorn, that is, Lady Love. So from these examples, which unfortunately are extremely rare, we get to know precisely who the divine figure was, and also from the shape of the letters, we can say something about the date of these two sculptures, which are clearly, let's say, 9th century, give or take a few decades, certainly possibly into the 10th century, perhaps also the 8th. So as I say, unfortunately, such label inscriptions are extremely rare, and none of them are available for Buddhist icons, which is the subject of my talk today. Neither is explicitly Buddhist. This piece, which I published a few years ago, which when I photographed it in 2010 was being sold by a dealer in Jakarta, and I don't know where it went afterwards, which has a very rare Old Malay inscription. Now this piece was said to have been dredged from the Musi River at Palembang, and since basically all archaeological remains at Palembang are Buddhist, there's some reason to believe that this piece also was Buddhist, and there are details also in the text which point in that direction, although it's not certain. Now this is a very mysterious inscription whose meaning might be Padma Shri, the owner of this statuette, has replaced his or her mother and his or her father, or Padma Shri is the owner replacing his or her mother and his or her father, or Padma Shri is the owner of this likeness of his or her mother and his or her father. So unfortunately the text here, even though it's quite clearly engraved, is difficult to interpret because, as many of you may know, Old Malay is a very limited, is a language only represented in a few dozen texts, often very short texts. So when we find a new one, there are various problems in interpreting them. Now, by far the most common category of inscribed bronzes from ancient Indonesia bear this Yedharma formula with which King Kertanagara also started his inscription in the 13th century. So here's a nice Avalokiteshvara from the National Museum in Jakarta in gilded bronze, which there on the bottom of the back has this inscription in so-called Siddhamatrika script. That's a northern Indian variety of script, which was used in Indonesia a lot at various stages of history. Also, the first inscription that I started with was in the northern Indian variety of script. And this is quite rare if you look in the rest of Southeast Asia, where writing was almost exclusively in the southern Indian tradition of writing. But in Indonesia, we see exclusively in connection with Buddhism and Sanskrit language the use of this northern Indian script, which was precisely the same as what was used in Nalanda and other such important sites, some of which have already been mentioned. And here's another example of a Yedharma inscription on the back of this beautiful silver icon on a bronze base held in the museum in Leiden, with, again, in very clear northern Indian type letters, this Yedharma inscription, and the figure is here undoubtedly Mahapartisara, a deity to whom I will return later. Now, a very special work of art that I've had the honor to publish with two friends and colleagues just last year in Art Asiatique was discovered a few years ago at a site not far from Candi Plausan in central Java. And from the context and from various other reasons, it can be attributed to, let's say, between 800 and 900. And there's an inscription there on the back, which, besides this almost ubiquitous Yedharma formula, contains also a single word, Jinajik, written just on top of it. Now, this Jinajik is a mantra about which we can learn from various Buddhist scriptures which say something about it, and one of them is the very important Manjushriya Mulakalpa, which in a long chapter says the following. To begin with, there are heart mantras in all mantra families. First, he, the practitioner, should once pronounce them, twice, sevenfold, or once. Then the seal must be displayed, a mudra. No other procedure should be adopted. Which procedure? The heart of all Buddhas is Jinajik. This one, O Venerable Ones, is the all-purpose heart of all Buddhas. All of the seals in the Buddha family must be displayed. Then he should perform the ritual. Arolik is the all-purpose heart of Avalokita, that is Avalokiteshvara. It serves to achieve all attainments in all rituals and is to be uttered by the adept who displays all seals in the lotus family. Vajradruk, this, O Venerable Ones, is the heart of Vajrapani, and the seals to be displayed by the adept who utters it in all Vajra families. So this is quite obscure, I imagine, for people who are not used to reading this kind of text, and it's even obscure for people who are. But what is important here is that we have a group of three. I must admit that I'm cheating slightly, because if you have the bigger context, there are in fact other mantras and more figures, but I think it is correct to say that this mantra Jinadik is here presented as part of a triad where you have some kind of essence of all Buddhas surrounded by or accompanied by Avalokiteshvara and Vajrapani. Now this is very important for interpretation, because we find triads with Vajrapani and Avalokiteshvara at many, many places, sites in India, and in many, many examples from Indonesia and Thailand mainly. This is an example that was on sale 14 years ago at Sotheby's. I don't know where it is now, but you can see quite clearly the figure on our right holding with the Vajra there above his left shoulder. So Vajrapani, and you can see somewhat less clearly the Avalokiteshvara with the lotus growing. There's actually a flower just visible above his left shoulder. And you see the Buddha in precisely the same position as with this Rajasa, this Buddha held in Semarang, found from this site, this village Rajasa in central Java. So if you combine all these facts, the mantra being written there, the information from this text, and the availability of many triads. Now, I must also say that not all of the triads, or in fact most of them, are not so clear about who the three figures are. There's another example here in the Met, which I was going to show, but then decided in favor of this one, because the one from the Met is, let's say, the identity of the two surrounding figures is not as immediately clear as it is on this example. So this is just an example of how this inscription can build a bridge towards textual evidence, and then if we assume that this single Buddha was part of originally a larger set, whose two other members are now gone, allows us to make a rather significant step forward in identifying the iconography of this image, which by previous scholarship would have been called rather Vairochana, and which I call Shakyamuni for, well, various reasons which are perhaps too complex to explain here, and for which I recommend that you consult our publication. So now to this example on the left in the Met's collection, which has a very nice inscription going all around its base, and just, this is a very common iconographic type found in, I suppose, dozens of examples, some of them attributed to Java. This one on the right we know that it is from Palembang. It's held in the museum, Bala Putrareva there. So it's a type that was represented both on Sumatra and on Java. And thanks to John Guy, a few years ago, I got these very nice photos giving details of the inscription, which I was able to decipher, and which, as is often the case with such inscriptions, is, as philologists say, extremely corrupt. That means we don't actually read what we expect to read, and so then we apply within certain bounds of our knowledge corrections, which would yield the text there visible in the middle, and the translation runs as follows. Entities come into being dependently. There is no entity that derives from an independent existence. Those who understand dependent origination, they know the true nature of reality. Now this is a statement of a very, very, let's say, perhaps the primordial teaching of Buddhism, but what is, and which resembles very much the contents of this Ye-Dharma formula that I started with, but strangely enough, this is a unique expression of this text, even with our modern computerized means, which allow us to search through all published Sanskrit Buddhist texts, and even Chinese Buddhist texts, and even Tibetan texts, etc., etc. Now, I must say I don't know all those languages, and I can't check all of those sources as thoroughly as others, but it seems to be the case that this precise formulation, at least in my corrected form, neither in my corrected form nor in the actually written form, is found in any text. So this means presumably that there were texts circulating in ancient Java which have not survived in any other form in any other Buddhist country. So we have here a small peek into the history of Buddhist literature afforded by this inscription. And again, of course, a statement of the motivation for producing this work of art. Now I come to the only piece of my presentation, which is also included in the exhibition, although, as the catalogue says, probably datable to the 9th century, so strictly speaking, beyond the scope of the exhibition. And I was very happy to see when I was emailing about this with John, actually before I saw the catalogue, that he has independently reached the same identification that I had reached. Actually, no, I cannot say that I had reached it. Colleague Gert Mavison, working in Berlin, pointed this piece out to me a few years ago, and its a reference is included in an article on Mahapratisara that has just appeared in the Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies. And so Mahapratisara is a protective goddess found in quite a lot of examples in prints from China, from various first millennium sites, in various sculptures of Eastern India from the 8th and 9th century, and since an important article of Mavison of 1999, various bronze sculptures from Java and also one stone relief from Chani Mandut have been re-identified as Mahapratisara, whereas previous literature would often identify them as Chunda or other Buddhist goddesses. And so now this piece from the Rockefeller collection, which I think was previously also identified as Chunda, although I'm not even sure of that, 8-armed and ascribed to Sumatra, although I don't know on really what evidence. This piece has also been identified as Mahapratisara. Now this is a complex case. I won't read to you all of this slide, but as with many other aspects of Buddhist iconography, lots of what we think we know is based on texts such as the Sadhanamala and Nishpana Yogavali, which date to the 11th and 12th century, which means several centuries later than much of the actual sculptural evidence that we have. And so the big question is whether those textual sources, which identify certain icons as having so many arms and so many heads and this and that attribute in their arms and this or that color, whether that tradition of the 11th and 12th century already existed at the time of the sculptures that we're dealing with. And it seems in many cases quite clearly to be the case that there has been a great development from, let's say, the 8th, 9th century to the 11th, 12th century when those texts were written. And so if you look, for example, at the case of Mahapratisara, the Chinese examples are, funnily enough, actually not a woman, Mahapratisara, but a man who has 1 head and 8 arms with various attributes. And many examples are found in China and Japan. And then in India, in the 8th and 9th century, you have a woman with single head and 8 arms. And so it's basically sort of the shared correspondence partially with the textual evidence that is later and the visual evidence from China and some more pieces of evidence that Mavison decided to ascribe the identity Mahapratisara to those single-headed, 8-armed ladies from India and Java. And so now I want to add to that corpus of 8-armed figures this 10-armed figure and single-headed lady held in the Museum for Asian Art in Berlin, who has been previously identified as Chunda, who has been published several times, and this is quite common, unfortunately. The piece has been published several times either without mentioning the inscription on the back at all, or mentioning the inscription on the back without publishing a photo of it, or mentioning both and showing both, but giving an interpretation which is wrong. And if you look at the text, and so there on the left is the transcription of what the inscription says, you will find that you find precisely the same text in this important, or the foundational scripture for this lady Mahapratisara, the Mahapratisara Mahavidyarajni, Sanskrit text existing in hundreds of manuscripts, the earliest ones known from 6th or 7th century Gilgit in northern Pakistan, many manuscripts from Nepal, and now also some, besides this inscription, also another larger inscription from Central Java figuring in this article that I've mentioned, where we find parts of that scripture actually quoted. So here we see on the back of this 10-armed figure these mantras coming from a single text, not found in any other text, and a text which gives the mantras for and the reasons for worshipping this figure, Mahapratisara. So that is, I think, about as strong evidence you can get, except in such cases as those label inscriptions, for the identity of a figure. So that if we accept this textual evidence, that means that we have to go back again to the iconography of Mahapratisara and accept that she did not only exist in 8-armed forms, but also in a 10-armed form, which again has partial reflections in that in those iconographic texts of the 11th and 12th century, but with certain differences. And just to conclude my talk, you see here that the inscription on the back of this sculpture ends with Om Yete Svaha, which is a kind of abbreviated version of this Ye-Dharma formula that I opened with, and an abbreviated version that seems to be limited to, let's say, the Indonesian archipelago in a large sense. There are stamps from southern Thailand which also give this, but otherwise it seems to be limited to Indonesia. From Indonesia there are several examples of this abbreviated Ye-Dharma formula, and with that I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.